Thank you for coming. It's really a pleasure to have Cynthia Dwork visiting today from Microsoft Research. I've known Cynthia since my graduate school days in Berkeley when she was at IBM in Albany. And she's worked on many different areas. At the time that I met her, she was mostly working in distributed computation and cryptography, and she's made foundational contributions to the early work on fault-tolerant systems. And for this, she won the Dijkstra Prize along with Nancy Lynch and Larry Stockmeyer. In cryptography, she's also made a number of really important and lasting contributions. She, along with Mickey Aitai, she developed the first public key crypto system that's security was based on average case hardness instead of worst case hardness. She developed proof of work systems with Money and Or to prevent denial of service attacks, which is now the underlying technology in systems such as Bitcoin and Hashcash. And then since then, she's been a pioneer in the area of privacy-preserving data analysis, which she's going to tell us about today. Cynthia was an undergraduate at Princeton University, got her PhD at Cornell with John Hopcroft as her advisor. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering, and the National Academy of Sciences. It's really a pleasure to have her today. Please join me in welcoming her here. Thank you.
Hi, it's really nice to be here and wonderful to see Sandy again. Good, so I am going to need two people for this talk, so let me introduce you to Helen Nissenbaum, a philosopher who studies philosophical issues that arise in the context of new technologies. It was Helen's early interest in privacy in public. What does privacy mean in public when there are surveillance cameras? What does it mean when records, court records are available and easy to access using computers rather than having to go and sort of manually pore over things and so on. It was Helen's early interest in this that got me interested in privacy in general, and I began to look for a piece of the giant privacy puzzle that might be amenable to mathematical analysis. And so I settled on privacy-preserving data analysis. Now, for the purposes of this talk, for simplicity, I'm going to focus on a single scenario in which one or more data analysts is interacting with a database, and so you can assume that the database is filled with useful but very sensitive information about individuals, that perhaps the database was drawn from some underlying population, and that the goal is to learn about the population as a whole without compromising the privacy of the individuals who are in the data set. So it's an intuitively natural thing to look for, and one of the motivating scenarios in my early work was the census data, because census data enjoy legal protection. Privacy is legally mandated. But there are really zillions of other applications, such as, say, early detection of an epidemic based on over-the-counter drug purchases, or analysis of loan application data for evidence of systematic discrimination, and so on. This is at least a 50-year-old problem. Some of the earliest work on finding a method for allowing people to answer questions about, or encouraging them to honestly answer questions about embarrassing or illegal behavior showed up in 1965 in the work of Warner. Now, one approach that many people think about when we talk about privacy-preserving data analysis is de-identification or anonymization. So in this direction, people think about having the original data set and having some kind of mechanism or algorithm that operates on the original data set and kind of magically, after doing some stuff to it, produces a de-identified data set, which somehow doesn't have identifying information and allows the data analyst to analyze to her heart's content without compromising privacy at all. You might also have heard of that as called anonymized data. And my one sentence comment about this is de-identified data isn't. Either it isn't de-identified or it isn't data anymore. And there is a host of results from both the popular press and the technical literature explaining, or demonstrating that this is the case and explaining why this is the case. And I'm not going to spend time on this anymore during the talk, although of course I can answer questions about it. So if that doesn't work, what about if we say, look, we're just going to allow interactions with the data set, so an analyst can ask questions and get answers, and we are going to restrict the data analyst to statistical queries. Now, we haven't defined statistical queries, but you probably all have some kind of an intuition that says that a statistic is somehow talking about a set and not about individuals. And that if we could somehow constrain the analyst to asking only statistical queries, privacy would not be compromised. Now, I call this the statistics masquerade. So one immediate problem that statistical queries fall to is an attack called the differencing attack. This is done by issuing a pair of queries that have a special relationship. So for example, we might consider the pair of queries, neither one of which seems particularly disclosive about any individual, but together are completely disclosive. So the first query might be, how many members of the House of Representatives have the sickle cell trait? So your intuition tells you that if you have the exact answer to that question, you really haven't compromised the privacy of anybody in the House. It's just a feeling, we haven't made it formal, but that's what many people feel. And part of the intuition for that is that somehow you're asking a question about a large set of people, so the data of no individual is playing a very big role here. But if you also get the exact answer to the question, also about a large set of people, of how many members of the House of Representatives, other than the Speaker, have the sickle cell trait, then if you take these two answers together, you can determine the sickle cell status of the Speaker. Now, that's a special case of something that I like to call the Big Bang attack. It's also called a Dinur-Nissim attack in honor of Dinur and Nissim, who gave the first such attack, but it has been generalized and strengthened in a large number of ways in the intervening years since 2003. And we don't have time to go into exactly what this attack is, but I think that it's fair to summarize it by a sort of fundamental law of information recovery. The fundamental law of information recovery says that overly accurate estimates of too many statistics is blatantly non-private. So in fact, Dinur and Nissim didn't even have a definition of privacy, but they had a something which everybody would agree was really not private. And they showed how an adversary could achieve this really not private state of affairs by asking and getting responses to, getting overly accurate responses to too many statistical queries. And of course, all of these things are formalized very precisely in the attacks. Here is just an example from real life supporting this kind of attack, or this kind of notion that statistics can in fact be very disclosive. So this is from some work of Homer et al. From 2008. Suppose for simplicity that rather than being two-strand DNA creatures, we are single-strand DNA creatures. So let's suppose for a moment that each of us was just represented by a string of A, C, G's, and T's. Now, in a genome-wide association study, in a very simple genome-wide association study, you have two sets of people, a case group and a control group. The case group are a set of people who have been diagnosed with an illness, and the control group is a set of healthy people. Now, for almost all of us, almost all of our locations in our DNA, we all have the same values. We all have a C in the same place, we all have a T in the same place. But there are a number of locations in which there is some difference in the population. Say perhaps 94% of the population might have a C, whereas 6% will have a T. The more popular protein is called the major allele, the less popular one, the minor allele. And I've simplified this now because I said we were single strand. And one of the things that a simple genome-wide association study will do is it will look to see whether the allele frequencies in these special locations, these single nucleotide polymorphism or SNP locations, the statistics for the major allele differ between the control group and the case group. So they're looking genome-wide for an association of a particular SNP with an illness. So people would publish the statistics for the major and the minor alleles in these SNPs. What Homer et al. Showed was that if you got a sample of my DNA, say from here, you could test whether or not I was a member of the case group. Now, it may be that my DNA looks like the DNA of somebody who has an illness, but that's quite different from being a member of the case group, which is a set of people who have been diagnosed as having the illness. So this was considered a serious possible privacy breach, and the National Institutes of Health changed their policies regarding publication of statistics for these kinds of studies that were carried out with their funding. In general, what we know from the literature and from the popular press is that things are way, way more complicated even than that. So in that particular setting, we used some extra information, which was my DNA information, which we got from here. But there are all sorts of extra sources of information that can be available when one is trying to compromise privacy. And that as data sets become available and it's possible to observe changes in recommendations that are made and so on and so forth in response to the actions of individuals, these sources of information flow and combine in mysterious ways and result in lots of privacy breaches. And all of these pictures refer to specific stories from the literature. So basically, in modern times, things are much worse than they used to be because databases are no longer in vitro, but they're actually in vivo. LaTanya Sweeney, when she was CTO of the Federal Trade Commission, said, computer science got us into this mess. Can computer science get us out of it? And that's what we want to talk about. So let's go back to our setting of privacy-preserving data analysis, and let's say, what could we possibly mean by privacy-preserving? So here we have our database. It contains lots of secret information about Helen. The data analyst interacts with the database. What do we mean by privacy-preserving data analysis? What kind of protection should we be offering to Helen? So one of the first things that one might try would be, you shouldn't be able to learn anything new about Helen, anything you didn't know from other sources of Helen, like her website, her publications, and so on, that you didn't know before interacting with the database. And it's a very natural definition of the database not sort of helping you to compromise Helen's privacy. And in fact, not only is it the direct analogy to semantic security for a crypto system, and therefore it's the first thing that I tried coming from crypto as a background, but it was also a goal that was articulated 5 years before semantic security by the statistician Tordellinius, talking about what he was calling a statistical database, and we're calling a privacy-preserving data analysis algorithm. The problem with this is, if that's really your goal, then what was the point of your data set? So let me elaborate. Suppose I come from Mars, and I believe that all humans have 2 left feet. And in particular, I think Helen has 2 left feet. Of course, I'm wrong, and by interacting with the statistical database, I learned that almost all humans have 1 left foot and 1 right foot. Now, I've learned something about Helen. But did I compromise her privacy? So ideally, I would in fact learn the same things if Helen's replaced by another random member of the population. And that's exactly what would have happened in this case. Had Helen been replaced by Latanya, I still would have learned that the vast majority of humans have one left foot and one right foot. And now Helen isn't even in the data set. So we're simply going to declare this not to be a privacy compromise. This property is also known, at least in the machine learning literature, as some form of stability. That is, you learn more or less the same things even if your data set changes a little bit under small perturbations of the data set. So in words, differential privacy, which is going to be our notion of privacy, says that the outcome of any analysis, and this is in English words, the outcome of any analysis is essentially equally likely, and I will be precise about the probability space for the word likely, independent of whether any individual joins or refrains from joining the data set. So in other words, we learn basically the same things if Helen is there or Helen goes away. If Latanya is not there or Latanya joins, or if Helen is replaced by Latanya, we still should learn more or less the same things all the time. And if we do, then we will say that this is differentially private. So before we get into the mathematical definition that captures this, what about the data analysis part? Like, it's not enough just to be privacy preserving, you also want to be able to analyze your data and learn useful things. So here's just a small hint as to why, with this kind of definition of privacy, it still might be possible to have useful data analysis. So, people always talk about a tension between privacy and utility. But if you are familiar at all with the learning literature, you know that stability not only preserves privacy, which we're telling you, the learning literature doesn't tell you that, but it tells you that stability helps to prevent overfitting, that your conclusions should, in the learning field, you want to draw conclusions that will generalize to your population at large. And stability is a necessary condition for that to happen. So that's just a little bit of an inkling as to why we might be able to get somewhere with this approach. So the key point again is that here, privacy and generalizability are in fact aligned, and that's going to be really nice for us. So this is the definition of differential privacy. It's from joint work with McSherry, Nissim, and Smith. It's going to have a couple of parameters, and I have to tell you a few things before we actually get into the definition. So first of all, there are two parameters. I could have given this talk without the second parameter. It is often 0. For now, let us take it to be 0. Delta is 0 for now. There's one place where I'll show you it's not, but for now we're just going to say epsilon 0 differential privacy. Now, we say that two data sets are adjacent or they differ in one element if one of them is a subset of the other and the larger one has the data of just one more person. So the smaller one might be the data set without Helen's data, and the larger one, the same data set, but now we add Helen's data to it. Okay? Finally, or not quite finally, we're going to allow our algorithms to be randomized. So what that means is when we fix the input to a particular database and we run the algorithm on it, we get a probability distribution over outputs according to the coin flips of the algorithm, not necessarily just a single output, not a deterministically chosen single output. Okay, so we have probability distributions over outputs, and we have neighboring data sets, and we have a parameter epsilon because we're taking delta to be 0. Good. So our randomized algorithm, M, called the mechanism for reasons that I cannot remember, gives epsilon 0 differential privacy if for every pair of data sets that differ in the data of just one person, and every possible event, i.e. subset of the outputs, the probability that this event occurs when the database is X is very close to the probability that the same event occurs when the database is Y. where very close to is multiplied by e to the epsilon. When epsilon is small, that's approximately 1 plus epsilon. So if epsilon were 0, we'd have perfect privacy, but we'd be getting basically the same behavior exactly on every pair of adjacent data sets, and we'd never learn anything. So we have to allow for some difference, and we control this difference in probabilities of events in a multiplicative way by this equation, inequality. Now our probability space is over the randomness of the coin flips of our algorithms. Not the choice of the data set, but the coin flips of the algorithm. And that's good because we control the algorithm, the good guys control the probability space. When we have delta non-zero, we get a slight relaxation of this. And typically when delta is not 0, it's very, very small. It's what we call cryptographically small, typically. Now, this is a very general definition. Sometimes we call it an ad omni as opposed to ad hoc definition, in the sense that I don't know what all of the bad events are in my life. Like I'm applying for insurance and the insurance company consults some database and there are some outputs that would be bad for me because they would result in my paying more for insurance. There are some events that are good for me, which would mean I would pay less for my insurance. The key point in differential privacy is that if a bad event is very unlikely when I'm not in the data set, if I'm very unlikely to be busted for grow lights when my data are not in the smart grid data set, then I'm very unlikely to have this bad event when I am in the data set. That's what differential privacy ensures. Because if this number is small, that number has to be small. It's just that simple. So, people will tell you when they have methods for sanitizing data or doing various things that are sort of not rigorously worked out, and you say, well, what if such and such happens? And they'll say, oh, well, that's really unlikely. My claim is they have no idea what they're talking about. They have no probability space. They have no way of measuring how likely it is that someone will have access to some other kind of information, perhaps some years in the future. You just don't know. But what differential privacy says is even though you cannot know the actual probabilities of bad events, you can control the change in risk, the multiplicative change in risk incurred by allowing your data to be used in the data set. We call epsilon our measure of privacy loss. Okay, so here are a couple of properties of differential privacy. First of all, it's immune to auxiliary information. So just out of curiosity, has anybody heard about the Netflix prize training data, the re-identification? Okay, great. The re-identification of the records of William Weld by LaTanya Sweeney, by cross-registration, well, by cross-linking with the voter registration records. So these are attacks that use auxiliary information. They take information from somewhere over here and they somehow link it up with your so-called anonymized data set, and they re-identify people this way. If you do something using differential privacy, then whatever you do is immune to auxiliary information. Not only auxiliary information that exists now, but information that may exist anytime in the future, that you might get your hands on anytime in the future. It's also immune to post-processing. That is, this is a statistical notion, not computational. So if something is done in a differentially private way and the data analyst who might be malicious takes the output and goes off and computes for a really long time, no further privacy compromise happens. They can't win by post-processing. We also have, as I mentioned, a concrete measure of privacy loss, which is more nuanced and more powerful than a single bit of, yes, it's private, no, it isn't private. And one way in which we see this extra power is that we can understand intuitively how the epsilons and deltas add up. That is to say, we can analyze the behavior of privacy loss under composition. We can bound cumulative privacy loss over multiple analyses. We'll get back to that in a minute. We also automatically ensure group privacy. So if an algorithm is epsilon differentially private for an individual, then it is 5 epsilon differentially private, say, for a family of size 5, automatically. My favorite part about understanding behavior under composition is it lets us program. That is to say, if we design little differentially private building blocks where we understand exactly what the privacy loss is, we can construct complicated differentially private analyses that can do really interesting computations and understand their cumulative loss. So we can program in a differentially private way and understand how much damage we're doing to privacy along the way. This ability to program, that give us a platform that lets us combine things in an intelligent way, is tremendously powerful. With that in mind, let me tell you about at least one simple differentially private building block. It is the simplest, yes.
So the assumption that you're making is that the privacy problem can be postulated as a membership problem in a given set.
No,
is that true for?
I'm not. I don't see why that is true.
Yeah, I'm actually trying to find, because here's a set of collection of things, whether I'm part of it or not, and the statistics being meaning whatever it is.
So here's the way I like to think about it. If you can't even tell whether or not I'm in the data set, then the process hasn't leaked my personal information. Okay.
Okay, I guess the
But anyway.
question is a bit different. It is that is any privacy, large number of privacy problems mappable to a question of this kind, where you have a collection of data and you're asking basically or you're trying to infer the presence or absence of a particular tuple or a person.
So
in
I
that
would say
record.
it goes the other way around. I would say that if you cannot even tell if somebody is a member, then you can't learn anything else about them. So it's not that all attacks are mapped to this, it's that this protects not only against most interesting attacks, but even against a larger class which might or might not be interesting. It's a very, very defensive posture. And it leaves room for someday somebody finding something between these two barriers. Yeah. Okay, so a building block and symmetric noise addition. So let's look at real valued functions. Here's a bunch of data points on the real line. And I want to compute, let's say that is my data set X, and I want to compute, release to the public, a value, the goal is to compute f of x and say something about that, and f of x is indicated by this star. Now, suppose we add a point. So instead of now having the database X, we have neighboring database Y. It has the data of just one more person. That's that yellow point in the picture. The value of the function f now has shifted perhaps from the red star to the yellow star. We have a slightly different data set. It moves the value of the function a little bit, perhaps. So what we need to do is we need to, or the technique is to add some random noise to obscure the difference between f of x and f of y. This is the first step. So this might be the probability distribution when the data set is x, the probability distribution on outcomes when the data set is x, and this might be the probability distribution on outcomes when the database is y. And now the question is kind of how much noise do we have to add, or what should the noise look like in order to do this? So let's let the sensitivity of f, often denoted delta f, be the maximum amount that one person's data could ever change the value of the function. So the maximum over all pairs of data sets that differ in the data of just one person of the value of f applied to those two data sets. So the informal theorem is that to achieve epsilon differential privacy, it suffices, or epsilon zero differential privacy, it suffices to add symmetric noise that is scaled to, and for now think scaled to means this is the variance, standard deviation. scaled to the sensitivity of f divided by epsilon. So a few points. First of all, the noise, or the distribution from which we are going to take the noise, will depend on the function f via the sensitivity and the desired amount of privacy, epsilon, but not on the data set. So it doesn't hurt privacy at all to publish the distribution from which you're drawing the noise. Now, just to make sure that things are in the right place, if my data can really swing the value of the function around, then we have to add bigger noise to cover me up, to cover up my presence or absence. And sure enough, the sensitivity is in the numerator. More sensitivity, bigger noise. Epsilon is our privacy parameter. Smaller epsilon, better privacy. Better privacy intuitively says, smear that noise out. And again, epsilon is where it should be. It's in the denominator. Now, there are many things that you might want to compute where intuitively you're getting a better and better answer as your data set gets large. So for example, or at least a bigger answer as your data set gets large. So what about the common kinds of queries called counting queries, which is, say, how many people in the database are over 6 feet tall, or satisfy some other property P. As we increase the size of the data set, that number goes up, probably, right? Especially if you're drawing randomly from a population where there's some particular chance of hitting people that satisfy this property. So if you have a really big data set, your counts go up, but your noise stays the same. The noise distribution doesn't care about the size of the data set. So eventually, the noise is going to be completely dwarfed by the signal. And this leads to sort of the title of the talk, which is Privacy in the Land of Plenty. We started out very much looking at counting queries. And for those of you who know something from the learning theory community, counting queries are basically statistical queries, and SQ is a very powerful model. You can learn almost anything that you can learn in the pack learning model. And we really had in mind internet scale data sets. Differential privacy is not the right solution concept for an analysis of a study of 400 patients. It's entirely the wrong tool. You will not get useful answers. It's really intended for large data sets. So again, privacy in the land of plenty. Now, this was the informal theorem. The formal theorem, one formal theorem is that if you use the Laplace distribution, as illustrated here, you get epsilon 0 differential privacy. So here the standard deviation is the square root of 2 times delta f divided by epsilon. We were talking before about exactly that, but without the square root of 2. For vector-valued functions, something similar works, except instead of looking at the absolute value of f of x minus f of y, we look at the one norm, which is just the sums of the differences, of the absolute values of the differences in each coordinate. So to achieve epsilon 0 differential privacy for, say, a k-dimensional function, it suffices to add noise that is scaled and independently generated in each, scaled to this notion of sensitivity divided by epsilon, to each of the k dimensions in the value of the function. And similarly, if you want to handle multiple queries, going back to that series of 2 queries we had in the differencing attack, you would have to add noise not just scaled to one of those queries, but to the maximum sensitivity of the pair of queries. For counting queries, as we discussed earlier, the sensitivity of any single counting query is at most 1, because my presence or absence can change the answer to the question how many people in the database satisfy property P by at most 1. If we have k counting queries, the total sensitivity would be at most k. In the very worst case, k. So for that pair of queries, the sensitivity would be 2. Now, this justifies at least why I included the second parameter in the talk. If you relax the definition a little bit, you can get behavior that looks more like square root of k rather than k. But that's all I'm going to say about this for now. Okay. One more technique I want to mention to you, which we're going to use in the next part of the talk, is the following. Suppose there are a number of functions that you would like to compute about the data set, but you're not interested in getting the answers to all of them. You just want to know which one gives you the approximate maximum. So you might have a bunch of different counts, and you want to know which one is, roughly speaking, the count that's largest. So you're reporting the argmax of these different functions. So it seems like a lot of functions, and you might have to use sensitivity. You might have to use noise that's scaled to all of these guys together, but in fact you don't. It's enough to add noise that's scaled to the sensitivity of each particular function to its particular count, so delta of gi divided by epsilon to the ith value, and then report the argmax. And that's going to, instead of having numbers that look like m or square root of m, they just go away completely, and the noise is just scaled to what you would need for one of those functions. Okay. Now, there is a rich literature of differentially private algorithms. Basically, as with other algorithms fields, you have a bunch of tools and you combine them in intelligent ways, and that's what gives you a better algorithm rather than a less good algorithm. An algorithm that gives you more utility for a given amount of privacy loss rather than less utility for the same amount of privacy loss. And there's also a book which is available for free and legally on the web that Aaron Roth and I wrote, The Algorithmic Foundations of Differential Privacy. And just before I go on with the rest of the talk, let me remind you that differential privacy has its strengths, but it cannot be a panacea because the fundamental law still applies. In many cases, what we know how to do with differential privacy matches up exactly to what the fundamental law tells us is the best we can do. That's not true for all cases, but this is what we know at the moment in some cases. All right, so I know that there are some statisticians here, so I want to mention some recent work with Weijie Su, who's a grad student in statistics at Stanford, and Li Zhang, who had been my collaborator at Microsoft and is now at Google. So this is differentially private control of the false discovery rate in hypothesis testing. So let me give a brief introduction to hypothesis testing for those who are not familiar with it. The null hypothesis is the statement of there is no effect. The drug does not affect life expectancy. This SNP that we talked about before in the DNA is not associated with disease. So there are a bunch of things that you might want to test. You have a bunch of null hypotheses. And the game in hypothesis testing, from this completely inexpert view that I have as a computer scientist, is when can the null hypothesis be rejected? When can we say, oh, we'd like to reject, the data tell us that we should reject the assumption that the drug does not affect life expectancy. So the good stuff is when we can reject the null hypothesis. And the problem that is encountered in the statistics world is when you're trying to figure out when the null hypothesis can be rejected, you have to sort of distinguish random effects which come from randomness in the sampling from true effects. Yes, the drug really was effective. That was a true effect, as opposed to a random effect, where it just seems that way, but you were unlucky in your sampling. So the statisticians give us the notion of a p-value, which is the likelihood of an observation this extreme or more extreme under the null hypothesis. If the p-value is very, very small, it says that this was really unlikely to happen if the null hypothesis were true, so maybe we have grounds for rejecting the null hypothesis. So small p-values are considered indicative of statistical significance in some high, right? And the p-values are often defined in such a way that you would expect them to be uniform over 0, 1 for the true nulls. Good. So now, how small is small enough to determine statistical significance? Well, there are certain standard thresholds that people use, like 0.05 or 0.01. But all hell breaks loose when you have many, many tests. Because remember, the p-values for the true nulls are uniformly distributed between 0 and 1. If you have a zillion tests, then even with a p-value of 0.01, you'll have a zillion divided by 100 things that look like they're significant, but they're just there because of random effects. So one alternative would be to divide by m, but then you sort of lose all your statistical power and you don't even find the good stuff when it's there. And there's a whole literature now on changing the goal to controlling what's called the false discovery rate. So the idea is you're going to return now a set of rejections, and the hope is that at most some fraction of them, some q fraction of them typically, are going to be true nulls, and the rest will be good stuff. So the false discovery rate is defined as the expectation of the number of false discoveries by the total number of things that you have rejected, where you define that value to be 0 if v is 0. Okay, and the expectation in this definition is over the sampling. Good. So there's a beautiful algorithm due to Beniamini and Hochberg, which goes as follows. You're going to control the false discovery rate at some parameter q. So you take all of your p-values and you sort them, you lay them out. P sub 1 is, in this picture, is the smallest, and P sub m is the largest. And you define the jth threshold to be j over m times this value q that you're trying to control the false discovery rate at. And the algorithm is very simple. Starting at the right here with the largest p-value, you compare the mth, or in general the jth p-value, to the jth threshold. And if the jth p-value is smaller than the jth threshold, you say, great, I found a bunch of good stuff, and you take everything from there all the way down to the bottom. You say, those are the ones we're rejecting. If you're not below the threshold, then you say, okay, let's forget about that one, let's move to the next smallest p-value, and you just iterate like that until either you reject everything to the left of some point or you run out of hypotheses. Now, so this is my animation. There it is. You work until you find a place where this inequality is satisfied, and you take everything to the left. Now the intuition for this, and this is my intuition, it is not a sanctioned intuition. And those of you who know this field better than I, feel free to explain to me later if this is the wrong intuition. But my intuition is, suppose you only had nulls, so all the nulls were true nulls. Then if you look at the range between 0 and the jth threshold, j over m times q, you would expect sorry about that. You would expect that many. No. Yes. You would expect that many p-values. This is the fraction. You would expect that many p-values in that range. But if instead there are a whole lot more, instead of j times q, q is less than 1, instead of j times q, you actually had j of them, then you would think that perhaps at most a q fraction of those are bad, because that is true nulls, because we know that the true nulls are distributed uniformly. Therefore, most of them have to be good, and at most, again, a q fraction are bad. So that's why if you take everything from p of j down, all those j, you're very likely to get good stuff. Okay. Now, that, as far as I know, that intuition is okay. Now suppose we tried to do this, follow this same algorithm in a differentially private way. So here we have this algorithm, And we'd like to do it in a differentially private way. So remember, what they do is they first look at the biggest p-value. Well, we can't quite do that because if we looked at the p-values directly, we'd be leaking information. It's not differentially private. But we can use this report noisy max primitive that I told you about to get the index of the biggest one. And then we can make another query to say approximately what is the largest p-value. And we can compare that to the threshold. And we can now try to follow the algorithm. So in some sense, that works. But in this algorithm, if we fail to satisfy the threshold, we've kind of gotten our hands on nothing useful. We've paid now for privacy, and we have to go down to the next computation. So we're paying for the non-rejected nulls, or the bad stuff. And what we want to do is we only want to pay for the good stuff. So what that suggests is we could maybe start from the other side and work our way up. So now we're going to pay only for the good stuff. We're going to look, starting at p of 1, compare it to the threshold. If it's less than the threshold, we say we'll take that one, and we'll continue. And if it's not, then we just quit. And that turns out to be called the, strangely speaking, step-down procedure. It's very well studied in the statistics literature. The intuition that I gave still applies, but now we're only paying for the rejected nulls, which is the good stuff. So the algorithm is basically to iterate for k steps or until there's failure, report the noisy argument of the p-values, compare newly noised things to the threshold, and continue. And the justification for this is not only are we only paying for the good stuff, but we're not going to go for very long. We're going to go for a small number because we've got millions of hypotheses. Literally in the DNA, the chips are measuring 1 million SNPs. That's too many measurements for us to pay for with privacy. But the whole point here is to find hypotheses that are worthy of further investigation. So we don't have to find a huge number to settle on, a few to follow up on. It's enough to find a few. And we can scale our privacy loss this way to k. So in terms of making use of this, we have some robustness issues. That the traditional Benjamini-Hochberg algorithm has the property that all of the rejected hypotheses are sequential. And that's not going to be true for us because we add noise to things and things come in out of order, and you might get the third and the fifth, but not the first smallest, and so on. So the noisy values are out of order. You will end up rejecting only some things with approximately smallest counts, not truly smallest counts. You get gaps. The distributions of the p-values of the true nulls will no longer be perfectly uniform because we're adding noise to them. So there are lots of different issues that come up. And that means that we need a more robust proof of the control of the false discovery rate. So not only did we get this for privacy, but as a byproduct of this work, because we had to reinvestigate some existing algorithms, we ended up getting a completely new proof that also requires fewer independence assumptions than were known in a very, very large literature on the topic. So I'm not actually, I want to spend my last 5 minutes on something else, so I'm not going to go through the bounds here. But these are the bounds without privacy, and this is what they look like with. But let me go on to one more application of differential privacy. So I told you about differential privacy, and I told you about differentially private algorithm for controlling the false discovery rate, and how needing to revisit things also told us things about the non-private false discovery control world. Here's an application of differential privacy which has nothing to do with privacy whatsoever, but is privacy in the service of a completely different goal. So you've just seen a discussion about differential privacy in the context of worrying about false discovery in the context of hypothesis testing, even when the hypotheses have been laid out in advance. And In addition to the Benjamin-Hochberg, there are other techniques in the literature, such as sophisticated cross-validation techniques and the use of holdout sets and so on. But most of the theory is for the static case, where again, all of the questions are fixed in advance. And science is by nature an adaptive process. So the questions that I ask depend on the studies that you made. My second question depends on the answer to my first question. And the worry in particular is that when people are working on the same data sets, the whole questioning is going to evolve to overfit to the data set. And that's going to get worse because there will be large data sets. It will be completely infeasible when you formulate a new study to go out and find a comparable data set. Everybody will be studying the Google query logs if they can get access to them. My study will depend on your study, but it's the same data. And there are real problems of overfitting. So I'm going to call this accuracy in the land of plenty. So remember, in an interactive setting, the ith question could easily depend on the answers to the first I-1 queries. And the worry in the adaptive setting is that somehow the analyst will find a query for which the database is no longer representative of the population from which it was drawn. And the data analyst reports a surprising discovery. So let me go through that. I'm sorry. Okay. And the punchline will be that differential privacy will neutralize the risks incurred by adaptivity. So let me go through this in just a little bit more detail. The intuition is fix a query. So we talked before about what fraction of the population is over 6 feet tall. Fix that in advance. Now if you go out and you recruit a data set using respectable sampling procedures, you know that if your data set is large enough, the estimate that you get about the fraction of your underlying population by measuring the fraction on your data set that's over 6 feet tall is going to be pretty accurate. In other words, almost all large data sets will give an approximately correct reply. It's very unlikely that you'll get a big data set that gives you a very erroneous estimate. That's why statistics works. So the way I would phrase this is that most data sets are representative with respect to this query. Now, suppose in the process of adaptive exploration of the data set, the analyst finds a query for which the data set is not representative. We knew that was extremely unlikely if she had no information about the data set. Here it happened. So in some way, she has actually learned something significant about the data set. Doesn't mean she knows what she learned, but it means that she did something she couldn't have done without interacting with that data set. So it's not so surprising that preserving the privacy of the data might prevent this kind of overfitting. And what we do is we prove that this is the case. So there are known connections between notions of stability of a learning algorithm and its ability to generalize. And the stability notions that are considered in prior works do not compose. But composition is a really strong feature of differential privacy. It does compose, and that gives us a calculus or a toolkit for building complex algorithms that satisfy strong stability guarantees sufficient to give generalization, even under adaptive exploration. So with that, the data people will say, okay, so you told us that by using differential privacy to interact with the data, we will avoid problems overfitting problems that come from adaptive data analysis. But we don't care. We want you to get out of the way. We want to do things the way we always have. We love interacting with the data the way we always have. Down with differentially private interference, right? So my answer to that is, go ahead and make my day. So here's what I'm going to suggest. The reusable holdout. So normally, you get a data set and you partition it randomly into two pieces, a training set and a holdout set. and you say, learn on the training set and check your conclusions on the holdout set. And what I'll say is, go ahead, learn on the training set the way you always have, knock yourself out. But when you think you have a conclusion, check against the holdout set in a differentially private way. Whether you find that the holdout set agrees with you or not, you can still go back and train and so on and so forth and come back to the holdout set. So first of all, this is just interacting with a holdout set in a differentially private way. Think of an algorithm that has the entire training data set hardwired into its control. It does whatever it wants, and then based on that, it accesses the holdout set, and then it does whatever it wants, and it accesses the holdout set. That's just an algorithm interacting with a set, the holdout set, in a differentially private fashion. So in a traditional holdout set, you learn on the training set, you check the validity against the holdout, and those can be viewed as fresh samples because you haven't seen them before, and they're drawn from the same distribution as the training set. So if you overfit on the training set, you'll detect it here on the holdout. But then what happens? Whether you detect or not, what can you do? You can't just go back to the training set and work again and then check again on the holdout set because it's no longer fresh. It's no longer sort of playing the role of new samples because what you did in the interim depended on it. It's not completely unrelated to what you were doing. And this can lead actually to overfitting on the holdout set. So in the reusable holdout set, you learn on the trainout set, you check against the holdout via differentially private mechanism, and the whole point is, as with differential privacy, this will give you, and usually, this gives you useful information about the distribution from which your data are drawn without compromising the privacy of the elements of the holdout set. And so basically that translates with some work and a theorem into future exploration does not significantly depend on the holdout set, it stays fresh. And I know I flashed the names up, but my collaborators there are Feldman and Hart, Patasi, and Reinfeld and Roth. So in conclusion, private data analysis is a problem that's been studied for at least 50 years. Differential privacy is a general solution concept that's robust to the networked world and to auxiliary information. There is no competing theory of privacy-preserving data analysis. It could be that somebody can come up with one that, as we said before, has a place in there between those two boundaries. We haven't found it yet. And there are people who try, write down what are the axioms that you want from a privacy-preserving, from a definition of privacy-preserving data analysis. Do those axioms imply differential privacy? So John Ducci at Stanford and a student have been doing that sort of thing, and they've been trying various sets of axioms, and they've been implying either differential privacy or one of its popular variants. But I don't know. We've seen that trying to do things in a differentially private way can lead us to look at existing algorithms in a new way and get better, stronger theorems about them. And we've also seen that we can use differential privacy to do things that have nothing to do with privacy, but that somehow it is telling us something about computing in a stable fashion. What is the meaning, or what are the consequences of being able to compute with stability is a really exciting direction that is just beginning to be explored. Thank you. Yes?
So this connection to stability is very fascinating, very interesting. But tell me, in the second part of the talk, you kind of got rid of the epsilon that you had. What's the connection of epsilon to the stability? There must be something which is going on there because you're adding a noise or accuracy to the data itself, right?
That's right. So it's affecting the it's affecting the accuracy of what you can do, for example, with the holdout set. And I think that where it is currently is at a much more coarse level than what's necessary, say, for controlling the false discovery rate, right? But what it's doing, so that's the answer to your question. It enforces a certain kind of coarseness. However, that said, I mentioned that I mentioned the statistical queries learning model, and that statistical queries are very related to essentially the same thing as counting queries, how many people, right? This is something that has been studied left, right, and center in the privacy literature. So there are algorithms that are quite powerful that can handle, for example, an exponential number of queries where the exponential is in the size of the holdout set, and can tolerate up to the size of the holdout set squared statements of the form, no, you have overfit. You have to do something. So when you announce overfitting, you lose more privacy than when you say, no, everything is fine. So those parameters can be played with quite a bit to get much better accuracy. Yes?
So if you have a group of users that have different attitudes about how private they want to be, is there a way that you can, some users can sacrifice more privacy than others, but the data set as a whole has some generalized notion of this, or it only works if they're in a kind of uniform setting? Can you get more power out of it by exploiting the fact that some people don't care while maintaining privacy for people that do?
I don't know a way of doing that per query, but in some sense, imagine that you have a data set, especially one where you can retire elements. Now, somebody might say, all right, you can do a certain number of queries at this level of privacy loss, but after this much privacy loss, please retire me. And that person will get retired at that point. But people who are willing to have larger loss can stay in for longer. So you could do that. Yeah. And there's some writings about this kind of thing. There's, for a little bit of individualization, there's a paper called Our Data Ourselves, which is basically a combination of cryptography and these ideas. So we're using cryptography to get the effect of a centralized curator or algorithm. And there's room in that work for people to permit themselves to incur larger privacy losses. Yes, Dave?
Something that wasn't entirely clear to me. Are you envisioning systems where all the data is really there, still unprivate in the system, and the differential privacy is being enforced by the software queries that are allowed? Or is there some way of doing this in which the data as it's stored in your machine is itself already private?
Okay, that's a great question. And differential privacy makes sense in no matter how, you can have differentially private algorithms where the data are kept completely on the client and you randomize before you release anything. And so that's often used for the case where you don't trust a curator. It's also being used right now in the Chrome browser for telemetry in order to measure the prevalence of malware. And Microsoft will also be using that kind of, it's called the local model in our literature. We'll also be using that. It has the advantage of, as they say, pushing the trust boundary out onto the client, and it circumvents a lot of legal and regulatory issues that way, because you can say the privacy has already been rolled in.
Well, it also circumvents malware that might try to break the privacy.
It could do that. Now, the bad side of that is that it's less powerful. Sort of provably, there are things that are harder in that setting, less accurate in that setting. A lot of the, What's difficult in private data analysis is difficult even if the curator is an angel and the data are stored in a vault. It's the very functionality that you're asking for that's compromising privacy. So while your question is an important one, I have occupied myself largely with, even in the ideal scenario, what can you possibly do? Other questions? Yes.
Suppose I have a website where I want to allow people to sell stuff and give ratings to the people that are the sellers. And so I want to have a rating every
Right.
day for a seller. Presumably every day she sells something.
Right.
And she should not learn, beyond differential private considerations, what any individual rating she
Right.
received.
Right. So I don't have a complete answer to that off the top of my head. However, there is a notion. There's a paper called something like Differential Privacy Under Continual Observation, and I'm afraid to list my co-authors because there are two papers and they differ in one, and I may get it wrong, but Rothblum and Naor and Patasi are co-authors on that.
Does that still work even though we don't know yet how many
Yeah.
things we're going to sell? We don't know N? The big N?
We don't know the big N. So I'm not sure. Surely if we know how many sort of time periods we want to measure in advance, we can do it. I think that other people perhaps, if we didn't, I think other people strengthened it to the case where it's not known in advance.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Other questions? Yes.
So in this day and age, since technology is getting more and more advanced and people are advocating for adoptions of information technology, in this, one example would be electronic health records, but then one opposition to that is that there is the danger of it getting hacked and sensitive information being spread, but the way I see it, that can be said about any kind of information technology. So what can we do to prevent hacking or to counter that counter-argument?
Well, to prevent hacking, is Jim Civic still here in the audience? I mean, there's a whole field of security in within computer science that tries to, security and cryptography that try to prevent hacking. It's an ongoing and exciting set of challenges that people in this field face, but there is a research effort in that direction, and somewhat orthogonal to the problems that we're talking about in privacy-preserving data analysis. But it's a great field of study. Yes?
I have a question. So how do you calculate epsilon for your particular application? And is epsilon unique to just a query, or is it to the data set, or can you
Okay,
use it for...
great question. So, right. So for years, I worried, I felt that I had to be able to come up with an answer of how should we set epsilon? Nobody understands how we should set epsilon. Let me say a few words about this. So first of all, the failure to be epsilon differentially private could be catastrophic, or it could be that we are 2 epsilon differentially private, and it's not really a big deal. It's like saying if you don't meet this standard of security for a crypto system, it doesn't mean that the thing is completely broken, or it could mean that it's just a little bit easier than you thought it was, but not horribly easier than you thought it was. So it's kind of analogous to that. Now, Frank McSherry, one of the co-inventors of differential privacy, likes to use the analogy of time, that human beings have learned how to value time, and that we will learn eventually how to value privacy and how to set these epsilons. How do we get from here, where we don't know anything about how we should set epsilon, to there, where we do know. One possibility that I've been exploring with Deirdre Mulligan at the Berkeley iSchool is the concept of an epsilon registry. Kind of in analogy to, or not kind of, in direct analogy to a toxic release registry. So in toxic release registries, it's not that there's an upper bound on how much toxic stuff you can release, but you have to make it public. And then companies can start competing based on how little they release toxic stuff. And the community as a whole can get an idea of how much toxic stuff it's being subject to, and perhaps accordingly try to, set some caps and some limits. In our case, where you have companies that are basically using data and destroying privacy on a regular basis, we would say, publish your epsilons, pay a fine for infinity, like you have to try. And of course, the money would go to privacy research. But importantly, the hope would be to take people who not only understand the kind of data involved, but also understand the kinds of uses of data involved, and get those people to participate in the effort of trying to rein in the privacy loss. So that's all I can say on the topic right now.